my name is America Francis. I'm the Director of Operations for Steward Growth, and today we're going to talk about lemons, which is big life changes, transitions, unexpected events. Here with me today is Travis Marker, and he's also with Steward Growth. We're going to be talking today about endurance, or handling the ongoing nature of hard things.
Yeah, I think it's a great topic, America. I think that one of the things that people struggle with is that they can maybe prepare for like a brief, short emergency. Like the house floods, everybody rallies to come, save the house, and then by Monday, let's say it happens on Friday night or Saturday, then by Monday, people are like, "Oh, you don't have that all together yet." The idea that I only have so much bandwidth for your lemon, that I really don't have the bandwidth for being on call for a long time.
And some of these last a very long time, and you need a good support team. And I've actually noticed that a lot during this period of me getting divorced, of the limits and boundaries people have about how much they want to talk about it or listen or be there.
Yeah, like there seems to be a expectation that like we've kind of covered the steps, like you have to work the steps, and which is true, right? I mean, it's not, even with my car accident stuff, I've gone to therapy and my therapist just says you have all the steps, like you're aware of all the steps. And so in my head, you might think, well, does that mean I need to show up next week? Or like you want what? Like am I being excused, even though like I kind of just need you to help. The nice thing about paying somebody is that you can't pay them. And they kind of expect that you're going to be in it for the long haul for whatever reasons, because you have to process it for a while. The problem is with people you're not paying, like families and friends, they also start to feel like you're a lemon because you're like, man, like I don't know how to help you process this, particularly because sometimes there's decisions that you can't make. Like anxiety relates a lot of times to the things that we're anticipating are going to happen, or we're anticipating are going to come, or what happens if this happens. And sometimes our friends get tired of hearing that, like what about if the whole thing, or the question is, I need to make this decision. Well, then you should make it. Well, it's a hard decision. Well, I don't know how to make it. Well, sounds like you need to make the decision. Well, what happens if I make the decision? And so we can definitely wear out our support systems because they're like, look, this is a really long lemon. I got to get back to my life too. Like I have other things I have to sustain.
Yeah, and I think we can go back to talking about people's emotional reserves generally being lower than in other times. It just seems like everybody's kind of running on empty more after COVID and everything. People dealt with a lot of difficult things and depleted, and now it's hard.
Yeah. And I think that if
Therapist.
I think that the point is that when we're in lemons, I think like other than just stating the obvious that like people get wore out around us, I'm listening to a book on accountability. I think it's called How to Be Accountable. And the point is, at some point, we do have to say, what would a person do in my situation? Because I can't burn my resources. I also need my resources. So what's the most effective way to use my resources and make hard decisions? Because at some point, I guess being accountable to our lemons and being accountable to the endurance of things, at some point we have to say, like, what are the hard decisions I need to make right now? What are the things I actually can carry? What are the things I can actually endure? Because I can't pretend it's normal anymore. If it's going to be long, if it's going to be different, like when somebody has cancer, like that's when the family comes around and says, what are we going to really do? Like, how are we going to commit? Because this isn't the weekend problem. This is a different problem. Like even with my mom, my grandparents lived with us for a year through my senior year of high school, and then up until I went on my mission. And it worked out that as soon as I graduated, I worked the swing shift. So I would sit with my grandma who had dementia, and then my grandpa could go to the temple, and my mom could go do some things. And even like my mom and dad they started planning regular weekends that they just would take a weekend and go away, because they knew they had to diversify how they took care of my grandma. Because like for my mom, obviously there's a lot of stuff she's been dealing with, like that's her mom. And sometimes she's the only daughter, so sometimes moms are sisters, sometimes they're enemies, sometimes they're moms and daughters. So I remember that it was just interesting just to kind of not, as a graduating student, kind of perceive the tension, but also kind of just pay attention to how it was all going. And then after a year, then she transitioned to my uncle's house, because it was kind of like the rest of the family had to share their turn, right? But those, I think sometimes when we look at lemons, there are times we have to say what needs to happen, because we care about this person or ourselves. What needs to be the course of action?
Well, and that person needs to decide too. And sometimes it's easy to be a rescuer and say, I know how to solve that problem, and this is what you should do, or I have ideas for you. And it can be really helpful to be empowering to the person to say, I can tell you have some tough decisions, and how can I help? And then, so accountability. And then also, I'd like to talk about caregiver burnout for a second too, caretaker burnout, because sometimes we do accept these support roles and neglect our own, and then you kind of put yourself in a crisis yourself when you're helping someone else, because you're not paying attention to your own needs. And caretaking can be a really long-term thing too, even if you're not the one with the original problem.
Absolutely. So even like, particularly when people come incapacitated, they're not able to indicate, I mean, they'll need 24-hour care potentially, right? And so the caregivers definitely have to say, well, how am I going to budget my resources? Because it's no longer an option not to take care of this person. Like, they have to be taken care of. So how am I going to budget in gym time or sleep time or whatever? And sometimes it could be the community, the neighbors, the family, the church community, but maybe it has to be a paid for service, and the nice thing about with seniors, there's a lot more options for senior care, and senior benefits. So it might be finding a social worker, it might be finding uh like a caseworker who could help, like even calling your insurance and just saying, because I mean, there's a lot of things that now exist because of, the market care plans, that there might be options that people can get services, but some of it is like, I realize I'm burning out. Like, they have to be accountable for, like, I might have thought I was a hero, but I'm not a hero at the moment. I'm way burnt, and I need to definitely take care of myself. I totally agree with that. And so you have to, even with my family, like, I seem to be the one who is not the endurance runner when it comes to um sickness. Like, like, it seems like I'll, even though I feel like I've gone a long time, I've held my breath as long as I can. And sometimes, you have to say, look, I need you to, um, I care about you. I want you to have the care you need. I also need to go on a walk for a minute. I need to go eat for a minute. You have to be able to set limits, because the person you might be helping, they may not be ready for you to not care for them. But if you're really there, you have to be able to say, like, I love you, but I need to go do this,
Yeah.
which
Well, I
is
would
super
say,
tough. Go ahead.
yeah, communicating and setting limits and knowing our own boundaries is a big important thing for sure, especially if you're like, let's say you're a young mom or a person who has children and parents. Like, sometimes it just adds up. And I think our communities used to be more available for help like that, and I'm not sure that our families and communities provide the same level of care in that way that they used to. And in addition, with the seniors living so long and having such such ongoing needs. Like before, people died in their 60s, or I don't know. It just seems like now people might have years and years and years. You might be a senior and still caring for seniors. So some of that has escalated, I think.
Yeah,
And people run out of money. When you get into a financial situation where you can't pay for another caregiver, what do? Like you're burned out and there's no money to pay for someone else. It can get really challenging. Also, family sizes are smaller. So before, maybe there were 5 siblings or 6 siblings to take care of 2 parents, and maybe now 1 or 2, and you've got maybe you have a couple grandparents and your parents or whatever. And it seems like there's more of a burden on the younger generation just because of demographics.
absolutely. Well, and I think, this is a good discussion on health type concerns. Some of the other questions are the nature of the longevity. Like if a person is in a divorce, for example, that could be over potentially quickly, depending on the expectations they have about the divorce.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not referencing that specifically to your situation. I'm saying that,
I know.
a young mother came in with 5 kids, and her attorney's fees were already 100,000. She's like, "How do I make this stop?" And I said, "You make it stop. Like, you have to kind of at some point turn it off." But she's like, "But my kids are at stake, and this is at stake, and this is at stake." And I said, "Then how do
Did
you?"
you spend that $100,000 on?
Well, unfortunately, it's the animosity between the parties. The getting experts. They did travel. They had, lots and lots of hearings. They've had mediations. They had. I think there was some depositions. There was subpoenas. So, like when conflict is the thing that is creating the longevity, sometimes there's that question about, well, how do I reset my expectations about the conflict? What matters in this conflict? And obviously, when there's something important like kids involved, it is harder to give up. Sometimes when there's things like resources, like if the parties are, both middle class and both need the money, but they both kind of need, one needs alimony or one needs something else, or they need child support. Sometimes there's that question of like, well, we're just kind of, it's super hard to fix this lemon because we're both going to be stranded at the end. But some of that is looking at the expectations, saying, embrace that, embrace that you're going to be stranded, because then you'll be able to move on or whatever. Because maybe moving on will provide you more resources than spending the attorney's fees or going to court or travel costs. So sometimes there is that, I need to make a decision about my expectations about my endurance, because like I'm part of the problem, unfortunately, because of what I'm afraid to lose.
Part of the problem also gives you that element of choice where you're empowered to make whatever choices are available. And I think you've mentioned something important, which is sometimes you need more information and you need to talk to subject matter experts that can help you make those decisions. You don't have to make it by yourself. Maybe it's Google, maybe it's your friend who's been divorced, maybe it's every attorney you can find that is willing to, I don't know, look online for discussion groups, support groups, because people can help you make the decision. But then ultimately you have to make a decision and follow through with the action steps. That's part of that other Conflict Without Casualties book. There's such a great cycle there. So there's the collecting the information, and there's the problem solving, and then there's the decision. And some people just get stuck in the part where they're like, I'm gathering information, I'm working on a solution. But if they don't take the step and decide and implement that decision, they can't get to the next part of it.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes you're also in a lemon that has to just be resolved, right? That, let's say you're in a business and the business is profitable. And let's say that the business generally has, 90% of profitability related to healthy products or healthy systems or healthy, flows. And then all of a sudden, like there's a 10% thing that starts to require 100% of your attention that is not healthy because of the fallout and the liability and the risk connected to that thing. And so if you don't take care of that 10% like thorn in your side.
How you doing with that problem, Travis?
Yeah, it's tough because, well, what you realize is that you could allow that 10% to end a thing. right? But there's a lot of collateral damage to ending the thing because there's a lot of people impacted maybe by the loss of income or the loss of resources or the loss of the services provided. Because if your business services lots of people, then that healthy part of your business is now they have to look for new resources, they have to look for new solutions, they have to look for new things. And so you have a dilemma of how much is the pain of resolving the 10% because it's creating a lot of collateral damage and stuff versus, well, what are your resources if you have to just say to all these people like it's not going to work out. So sometimes the chronic nature of like a period of time in a business that could be potentially resolved, like so you know that it's not unresolvable, it just
Mhm.
may be long, but it relates to the sustainability of a lot of different things. So it seems like a responsible person or whatever, like an enduring person, should be able to say, I think I can do this.
And some of that is hard too, where maybe the people around you are saying, why are you having so much problem with this thing? Like, you were talking about, haven't you worked that out yet? Like, you're still upset about whatever it is. And you're like, yeah, I still care about this thing. It still hurts. Like maybe
Yeah.
it's an injury and it's not cancer and other people have cancer. And they're like, well, it's not cancer. It's still pretty good. And you're like, well, it's hard for me.
Yeah. Well, and that could be the example of like, a person who has an affair or, like, and maybe it's not like a pattern in the marriage, but the person just was in a vulnerable spot and had an affair.
Yeah.
So like it's now a 10%er because it doesn't represent the entirety of the marriage, but it now is a significant hiccup because it relates to trust, it relates to just, identity, it relates to a whole bunch of things in security, relationship intimacy and security. And so, at what point does the person who's like the wife or the husband who's is the victim, how long do they get to mourn that?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously everybody could be healthy if they could just, walk away from it, but that's not necessarily how life presents things that are painful.
Yep.
So I think it's interesting how if you analyze your current thing, right? And that depends on your capacity to actually do that. Because if you're not healthy, you won't be able to analyze the thing. You have to be able to say, I guess, first, am I in a position that I can process this thing? And if, let's say the weekend thing, like it becomes a flood thing and then an insurance thing and then whatever, there may be some long things to that
I
you,
had that happen. It
yeah,
took
well,
a really, really long time to get the basement put back together.
yeah, but at some point you probably said, I probably don't need everybody for this. Like I could
Oh,
probably,
other people didn't do a lot of help, but it was a long, like way longer than we expected. We thought we would just handle it, and then it was harder to do.
and so what would you say were the steps? Like, how did you process that length?
Well, at the beginning, you're just trying to assess what needs to happen and how you can do it. And it was a problem with our neighbor's sprinkler. So they had some responsibility and then their insurance took responsibility. And that was really awesome. But then it took a while and then we had to get help. And then we had to get different help because they charged us a lot and didn't do anything or did very little. So, I mean, it was hard. It was hard. We didn't love it. It
So
impacted a lot of living space for a long time.
okay, so it sounds like you had a couple layers. So you had the lifestyle layer, you had the service provider layer, you had the redeemable, like the person who's going to actually pay for it layer. Then there's also kind of the assessment of getting through the responsibility, like who's liable, so sometimes when we look at a chronic thing, it may have like pieces that you say,
Mhm.
I might be able to manage this better if I manage the pieces. Like, what are the pieces that are facilitating the problem? What are the pieces that are, you know, they're inevitable? Like maybe there's the cost is potentially inevitable, or the sickness is inevitable. Like a person with cancer, like there's going to be a process that's kind of inevitable. Like it's not negotiable. So how do you manage the unnegotiables? And then, like if there is an inevitable outcome that's unpleasant, like if you know that the final thing is just going to be painful, how do you set that up? But I noticed that in most of my situations, the closer I can get to embracing those things I can't control, and that this is that book again, Loving What Is, the idea that if you can get to the point of embracing the hard thing, like even like if you just know I'm gonna have my tooth drilled, or I'm gonna have like I'm gonna get divorced, or I'm gonna lose my business, or then you're not. It's actually easier to actually do those things like
It
that.
was very, very helpful to make that decision. You cannot make progress out of the hole until you say, I am in this nasty hole
Yeah,
and I can get out of it. And what I have to do is not easy. And I'm going to require help, and it's going to maybe take a long time. I think you're right about the pieces, and I think it's really helpful for us to look at people who have gone through it before. I'm a big fan of subject matter experts, and they don't have to have degrees. If you look at somebody in life who's had to go through whatever it is, they can help you avoid a lot of beginner mistakes, and they can point you to the support groups, and they can say, you're going to be okay. That is one of the most helpful things that's happened during this whole year. Is a friend, every time I see her, she says, things are going to work out for you. I just know it. I can see that you're going to get through this and be fine. And hearing, you're not going to be in this hole forever, just keep climbing. It's so, so helpful.
absolutely. But because the subject matter expert is in essence a mentor who's been there, right? Like they can show you the path and say, you only have so many more miles. This is
Or maybe they've seen someone else go through it. They don't even have to be a person who has personally gone through it. They can say, I've seen people in my family get past this, and their lives are good now. In a couple years, your life will look different and it will be better.
but it does take faith, right? I mean, you have to have faith in that better.
It does take faith. And you start to see positive things too. If you can just look at the positive things. I was listening to a song on the radio the other day, and I remembered that it was a song that I heard early on in my process, and it was a song about misery, and it was a happy song. And I started singing it back, a long time ago. And I was singing it, and I noticed that I was feeling happy when I was singing this song. And just recognizing, like, oh, look, like, I'm having a happy moment. It was really good. I was like,
So
yeah, I
what
remember I was happy, and I really enjoyed that.
it sounds like it was also part of embracing it. Like the fact that you could be happy about it. Like and you could
Oh, this is miserable, and I'm okay.
yeah, like if there's no other option, I guess let's do it. Like let's
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 do
let's
it.
let's dance, right?
I
Yeah, I
wanted to
think
talk for a second.
go ahead.
I just wanted to talk about a situation where a community is struggling all at the same time. Because if one person is having a big struggle, if one person's house burns down, then the community rallies, and that's great. And then if the neighborhood burns down or half the city burns down, Maui, right? Like, let's talk about some situations where wars. I was reading about a war recently where a big percentage of the population was killed. Just like 1 out of 6 people, or a ton of people were suffering at the same time. And let's talk about lemons like that are large scale. How do people get help when we did talk about COVID for a second, but when everyone is just not okay.
I wonder if it actually makes it a little bit easier to be large scale because there's so many people who can have empathy inside the system versus sometimes when a person is having a issue, sometimes the community is like, well, like, shouldn't they just buck up and like get over it? But if everybody's in this zone of like, I'm really struggling, it's almost easier to have the support groups. It's easier to have the COVID, you know, chats where everybody's jumping on just so they can talk about their COVID experience. You know, it's easier to like, we had family time often by Zoom just because it was collectively understood that that's how we were going to connect, you know, and it seems like some of the resources were a little bit easier. I also think that I wonder if there's also the dilemma of being an individual inside a system and wanting to have your individual experience. Like you want to be individually recognized, and yet you have so many competing things that are happening that, you know, like your son died, but then the next family lost five sons. You know, because this did happen in World War I. Like they lost all the men in a village, you know, like can you imagine that
I
type?
really cannot imagine how horrible that would be with all of the people that you relied on. I mean, communities mix up a lot more. Those would be like your families, the neighbors that you grew up with. It would be a very devastating situation.
Yeah. And you can tell that there's that sense of how it plays out does relate to a lot of personal resilience, you know, like if but like I would think that this is completely unresearched, just hypothetical, but I would anticipate the people who have had loss first, like people who have experienced loss or experienced war, will start to be the leaders for those who are new to it. Like
Yeah.
they'll be able to bring some resilience to the group empathy leadership process, the
Yeah.
compassion. And there may be some that are really horrible at it, you know, like maybe they're the ones who they lost the least, but it's just absolutely devastating. It doesn't mean they don't need compassion, but you know, there's going to be stratospheres that relate to experience, relate to their own personal resilience, that relate to just, you know, how to cope through stuff. Like at one point, there was an experience where a person was saying, you know, I'm in 25,000 in debt and I just don't know how to get out of it. And another guy says, well, I'm in a million. 25,000 is easy, you know, where that's not compassionate, but sometimes it's relevant, right? You're like, it's relevant to how, like like yours is just kind of a learning curve, but mine's, you know, like actually hard to sustain.
Let's talk about invalidation. Super important. I'm taking a DBT class right now, and invalidation really hurts relationships when people say your experience, whatever. I mean, we really want to feel heard and understood, and to have people say that makes sense. And it would be difficult to be in that situation.
Yeah.
So a lot of times we care about people and we say, you're going to be fine, you are fine, what, I don't know, whatever, like, cheer up. And that can be really harmful and invalidating. Somebody's depressed, you like, think happy thoughts, be positive, like, choose to be happy. You can say a lot of things, and that can really make things hard for people.
Yeah, when you and particularly depending on the group nature of the magnitude of the trauma, like we lose all of our resilience skills sometimes, right? We lose compassion, we lose empathy because now maybe we're dealing also with scarcity, we're dealing with homelessness, we're dealing with just tremendous grief. And inside, like, so if we have scarcity compounding with like the lack of empathy, and you know, like when people start looting, like that's the height of lack of empathy, right? Like they don't care, and it could be some opportunistic, but it could be a lot of scarcity, it could be vengeance, you know. So yeah, there's a lot of human responses that take place in trauma or trauma, micro macro trauma levels, that like robs us of our opportunity to be good.
We can invalidate ourselves too.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we're really competent and capable and something happens, we're just like, how come I'm such a mess? How come I'm a pile of goo right now? How come I can't get my life together? How come I'm so messed up?
Yeah. Well, and I think that some of this also comes to how we're wired. There's a book called Wired, and it's an attachment book.
Hmm.
And it may have more of a title to that, but it's basically like, I think the title was called Wired. It has a heart on it. But the in my house, I have no idea exactly what happened or how it happened. But when you got sick, you went to your room until you got better. Like mom wouldn't necessarily check in on you a lot. Dad probably never checked in on you. But it wasn't that you didn't feel loved. It was kind of like that's how you got better. Like you took responsibility for getting better. You went
Go to your
isolated.
bed, don't spread your germs, rest.
Yeah, if you're really sick, go lay down, like and it wasn't that it was a hard line. It was just more like, if you're sincere, go take care of it. And you had to kind of be sick until you were better. And then once you were better, then like you're expected to jump back in line and like get your stuff done and whatever. And so in contrast, my wife's was soups and back rubs and massages and
Well, you're
cozy
lucky
blankets.
you're married to your wife. She takes care of you.
Well, no, the hard thing was is that my wife would try to do that. Then I'm like, I'm
Oh,
sick, you know. Like, I'm going to go to my bed. I'm gonna go be
not
sick.
part of your system.
Yeah, and so she's like, well, but wait, when I'm sick, why aren't you coming and cuddling and holding? And I'm like, well, like get better. Like what is
I don't want to get sick. Get off me.
But yeah, I mean, I don't think I was that way, but it was more just like
I'm playing a little bit, but
yeah, but I
I
think
can see
yeah,
sometimes you get sick when you're around sick people.
yeah, but in the book Wired, it talks about how there's some people who are waves, meaning they need lots of kind of like stimulus and lots of engagement, and then there's some people who are islands because they go and they retreat and they're isolated and they have to have time to process. So
Hmm.
sometimes when we're in trauma and we have competing endurance issues, one side needing, that validation, the love, the affection, the coziness, which is definitely fine. Like there's nothing invalid about it. And then the other side being, um, I need to go process this for a while. And the others, so like if you have a group trauma and there's some islands and there's some waves, according to this book, using
Are you
their
talking
terms,
about anxious and avoidant? Does it map well to that or not?
a little bit, but it's also about coping styles and it's not exactly because the island is not necessarily unhealthy. It's just the way the island processes.
Okay.
Um, it could be some, and I'm not saying there's not.
Connection versus just needing some quiet time, whatever. What do they call it? The cave stuff? Like I
Yeah,
just
I
need
mean,
to go, but I'll come back.
yeah, and the nice thing about the book was that there's men and women who are islands. There's men and women who are waves, but the question is how do you express what you're needing through your endurance process?
Mm-hmm.
And you have to also appreciate what the other person is capable of. Like because I'm an island, that's why I'm one of the first persons to say this has been traumatic for me too. I need to go process this, even though the other person maybe like, well, yeah, but I'm still in cozy situation, and I'm like, I'm in go. I gotta go walk. So it's difficult to be, but obviously being civil and authentic and open about like this is where I'm at. I want to be available to you, but I also I need to process some stuff.
Well, and maybe we can also identify who the other waves are. Maybe one person goes off and the wave person has other resources in the support team that can be there.
Absolutely. And oftentimes that was my wife's sisters. I would call them like because I remember when we first had like little babies and stuff. I
How
was
do you
like,
feel?
I'm like, my wife needs your sisterly love. And the cool thing
Well,
was
and
is
that was very caring. That was very
well,
caring because it got her needs met.
exactly. I because I did care, I do care about my wife. So the idea was I her needs are valid, they should be met.
Yeah.
Her desire that I meet them, is not always practical because I'm not always good at it.
Well, maybe if you practice, you'd get better at it.
That is what I'm told.
That's what your told she tells you. Uh, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it is. And there is, I do think there is a question about being authentic about stretching, you know, like if you know it's important for somebody that you be present, if you care about them, you should try to be present. You know, like if you know their love language is whatever, you should try to work it out. You know, I mean, I think it is very valuable to say if you're paying attention and you recognize what's happening. I
Well,
think
if
it's
you're in
very
the type of
reasonable.
relationship that's close like that and you depend on each other to soothe and support like that,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, so there, I mean, there's plenty of times that I am cozy when I wouldn't say prefer to be cozy.
Well, and I'm thinking, when you're in relationships that are long term like this, like parenting relationships, romantic relationships, you do develop good skills over time so that you see that someone who's been in a relationship for 10, 20 years with somebody who has needs like that will be way, if they're responsive, they'll pick up some things and they'll be different than when they first started and hadn't practiced.
Yeah. Um, I think the hard part is often when you're in that tight situation and you realize you're both wearing out, how do you process it afterwards sometimes?
Oh, like there are situations where one person's got a lemon and the other person helps, and there are times when both of you are just like, I'm up to here.
Yeah, and then but you're also now hurting both you're both hurting because the other person can't be responsive or the person can't be engaging or they're performing badly or they're like they break badly, you know. Um and so sometimes there's that process of saying, you know, when I was like I know one individual came in and there was an affair connected to a person's death and funeral. So because two people
What?
were well,
Oh,
so
somebody died and somebody had an affair.
well, because what happened was it created an alignment with another person through the suffering.
Yeah.
And in that alignment, it wasn't with the spouse, it was with another person because they were aligned in the death of this other person.
Okay. That's a little confusing, but I think that happens in grieving situations. Sometimes you have to be careful when you're vulnerable like that.
Yeah, you're aligning with somebody who's getting the job done in essence for you, right? It doesn't mean that the other person is necessarily a bad actor, but the point is you're finding a source that is meeting a need, even though it's the wrong source.
Yeah.
So you have to come back and you have to process. When I was going through this grieving, I appreciate that I took the wrong course because I was broken, I was hurting. And I know that it is now hurting you because I didn't come to you or I didn't whatever. Like sometimes there's that post endurance process where you say, you know, what did I learn about my process? Like what did I learn about, you know, or what decisions would we make now that we're not in trauma or we're not in the process, we're not in the tension? How would we maybe resolve that if this happened again? Because most things do happen again, you know, like it's
I
okay to have a
know.
debrief.
That's a really nice thing about being our age, actually, is that we have some kind of track record so that we know what we've done in the past and what other people have done in the past. And that's helpful.
Yeah. And I think that being able, you know, for the person who was let down to be able to say to the person who let them down in a way that doesn't necessarily generate defensiveness, but also the person who's receiving feedback also has to be mindful of the defensiveness, right? The person has to say, I appreciate you were hurting and I let you down. Or the other person saying, I appreciate that I was hurting and I needed more from you. This is what it might look, this is what it may have looked like.
Well,
If
and
you
then we talk about accountability again. What was my part? What was your part? How are we changing things? Maybe we need professional help to navigate it.
yeah, but like what you're saying though also is in that process not invalidating the other person, right?
Mhm.
Because they need to be like their feelings are valid, their experience was valid. You may not agree with it, you may not have to own it, but that's not the process. So like if you look at John Gottman's book, Why Marriages Succeed or Fail, it has some great communication skills in it for lots of people, just about hearing the other person first, because most of what they're saying is not about you. It's about their experience with you. And but that it's first about their experience, that person's experience with whatever they went through.
So what people can do is they can try to reflect back the other person's perspective and see if they get it. Because if you say, are you saying this, and this, and they say yes, then they feel heard. But if they say no, they can explain more. But unless you try and express that person's perspective, they might just keep explaining, and you may not really understand what's going on with them until you try.
Yeah, and then because ultimately it's the way you're going to restore trust is by showing that you understand what happened. Then once you understand, again, the next kind of faith step is, instead of being responsive to it from a defensive position, you can own some of it.
Well, let's
Like,
put it into our example then. Like, I understand that it would be really hurtful if your spouse cheated, whether or not he was hurting, you know?
yeah, and the question is, how do you parse it out? So the husband and would have to say, I should not have cheated. The wife could maybe, and I don't even know if this is true or not true in their situation, but I'm anticipating the fact that the husband could or could not connect. There was some form of breach between the husband and wife. Like there was something that made it not a safe environment, not necessarily abuse.
Both of them too. It could be he was doing the island thing, or he was ashamed, or he was whatever.
But there's something that's making their relationship not fine, or they would have been a resource to each other. So the process with the wife being the other party would be that honest evaluation of what role potentially she is playing in isolating or being unavailable, because it's not a one-way street. Like even if
It's a system.
it's a system, exactly, and the system, if the system is not functioning, then the people don't come to each other, right? And it's interesting as I'm thinking about this, sometimes the system could be, if I was healthy, I should have walked away. I'm sorry that you were relying on somebody that just knew I shouldn't be there. Like I wasn't supposed to be the person, like we've maintained this system too long. We're not the people who we would rely on. We should have walked away already. Like we should have busted up the partnership. We should have, like, sometimes making a thing endure too long creates the environment for betrayals
Yes.
that then are hurtful, because you're saying, well,
Yes.
like
Somebody wants the affair to happen, so they'll get divorced, because they can't get divorced unless something happens that makes it required.
yes, and they're both waiting for this destructive thing, and then as soon as the person's a bad actor, as expected or anticipated, the other person still feels betrayed because they in fact did it.
Oh boy.
Yeah, I think that, I do think that the living authentically and civilly is so valuable, because it's a tremendous barrier if you're not. It's a tremendous resource if you are, but it also takes a lot of diplomacy and tact and comfortableness with yourself.
Yeah, you feel vulnerable if you're authentic, right? Then you're not putting up your best persona.
Yeah, if you know that you might be betraying yourself, like that's a problem. Like that's an internal, like cancerous problem. And so being able to be authentic and civil about, this is what's happening. I need to do these following things to make sure I'm taking care of myself. It would be helpful if you could do the following things that might help me take care of this problem. I know that you didn't create this problem, but you would be a resource to me if you could do the following things. Like having that type of dialogue and awareness about your situation would helps you get through it, right? I know even in the death part, right, where people are, like, most people spend majority of their health costs in the last 30 to 45 days before a person dies. And I'm not going to weigh in on whether that should or shouldn't happen, because people have to make a decision about that, right? They have to either embrace it or they have to process it. And depending on where they're at, like it may be a variety of things. If the person's like an infant, sometimes it's tremendously hard. If they're in the middle of their life, it's very, very hard. Like there's not really a good time. But if it becomes in a nature that is somewhat chronic and people are able to somehow participate, sometimes that is the conversation. We're embracing the end. Like let's dance. Like let's not have a problem. Like I had a really dear
Every
friend.
piece is a good part of the picture. You don't have the ones that you don't accept and the ones that you don't appreciate.
And say that again, that having peace.
No, I'm just saying that every piece, every pixel in your life is part of the whole that's important. And you can appreciate those that sometimes we just pick the pieces we like and we say, I'm all of these good things. And then the other things we're like, I don't want that part. That's not the ideal me that I would put together if I were putting it together. And sometimes you just have to be like, I'm all of it and I'm okay. And I'm overall a pretty positive
Well,
person.
and I think that that's the most invaluable thing, is when you can say, I'm okay with me, right? I appreciate that I'm not perfect for a variety of things or a variety of people or a variety of circumstances, but I really can't change who I am.
I mean, you can change who you are, but
Well,
today I'm
I
doing
think
the
you
best
can,
I can.
right? I think you can. Some things you can change. I mean, there are some things you can't change. Like you can adapt, you can audible, like you can modify, you can,
Goals,
yeah, you can
behavior,
seek
yeah.
for progression. But if there's some things that become like, like my grandpa, he lost most of his fingers in a corn accident, in the bailing things. Like he couldn't do anything about having, you know, five fingers gone basically.
Wow.
But he could definitely adapt, and he did. He was a very good guy. He was a very decent, adaptable person, but he couldn't pretend he had five fingers. But he could adapt. And so if somebody came up to it and said it's super important I have five fingers, he's like, I don't have them, but I'm okay with me.
Well, and
Like,
I think one nice thing that we have is our belief that um, everything will work out well and that things will be, I'm trying to think of a word, but just restored, right? Like we have a belief in resurrection that anyone who's injured or sick or whatever has big physical problems will have someday a perfect, healthy, a body that won't die. Like that gives us a lot of hope to know that things that are unfair will get restored or completed or whatever. They'll get better. They won't be messed up forever.
yes, I agree that that's definitely in our society's psychological system. I think also I hear people say it'll work out okay. And I think you need to be more honest about what okay means, because this is not going to not happen. Like sometimes it's going to happen. Like you like if you saying it's going to be okay often means I'm going to change the way I think about what's going to happen so
Like
that
the
I'm okay.
IRS is going to come, you didn't pay your taxes, you're going to prison, you're
Yeah, like you can't say it, you can't pretend some things will not in fact happen, but you can change the way you think about them. You can change the way you endure them. You can change the way you process them. You can change your expectations. And through that process, whatever the lessons you learn, the lessons you go through, or the things you realize, you can definitely do that. But sometimes you cannot say this thing's not going to happen. Like, and particularly if they're like I had a person who said we were in the juvenile court and she was losing her kids because she kept going back to her husband who regularly beat her. And it got to the point that um the state's like, you just are failure to protect. Like it's so often, it's so regular, it's so repeated that you are now a danger to your kids because we've done this before.
Yeah.
And it was one of those moments where I'm like, look, and I'm representing her and I'm trying to give her hope, but I'm like, you need to embrace this situation. Like you have to either make a substantial change, a substantial lifestyle change in which you really get this thing, or you have to embrace that you're going to lose your kids.
You're choosing one or the other. Your
Yeah.
choice is your kids or this relationship
Yeah.
or this
And
lifestyle.
yeah. And so we went to a mediation, and in the mediation, I kind of let her say that. And I said, I don't see any way you're going to achieve this in this timeline. Like, because in that situation, when your kids are removed, you have a certain timeline. And she said, God will not let this happen. And I said, God has done some interesting things. Like he's allowed a lot of stuff to happen, right? And it doesn't mean he's not God. It just also means
This
that
is
there's
your decision.
right. I mean,
God isn't going to remove the consequences of your choices.
yeah. Now, what's interesting about this story is we went down and we set a trial through a tremendous break for her. It was set 4 months out, which was outside the timeline, but the court was so booked up with trials that it was unavoidable. Like the court couldn't set it faster. And she literally did the work. Like she literally did like God did not change everything, but she actually did the work. Like she went to therapy, she went to counseling, she did everything, she got resources, and every witness that was put on the stand for her said she's doing amazing. Even the state's witnesses that were supposed to say she's like it's what it is. And so the judge, who was not a really compassionate, charitable judge, called a recess and told the state, I have not heard any evidence that supports terminating her rights. And I was like, wait, like this is what I told her would happen, right? But because we were all kind of like the system just runs people over. And so I was a little bit, like being held accountable because I was relying upon the worst thing to happen because that's just the way the juvenile court had worked. And this is the way this judge had even worked.
But that's the only reason she changed, because you told her the worst is going to happen. So she
Yes,
decided to change it. And because she changed it, it worked out okay.
she did. She had to make the thing,
Great
and she in
story.
fact did. And the court did not terminate her rights. And the court went out and said to her, like the state went out and said, we're super pissed in essence because we should have your kids and they should be safe. But unfortunately, and so they gave her a zero tolerance plan and she survived that. So like she really dialed it in. But I think
She
that
became safe for her kids
she did.
because they were protecting the kids, and she became trustworthy enough in that time.
She did. And I think that, I guess is our summary type case scenario. It's the idea that enduring hard things ultimately is about our personal accountability to that hard thing.
Well, and you have to get to that. She hit rock bottom. She said, there is no alternative to making this really hard change. I'm either changing or the bad thing will happen. She didn't wonder anymore.
Correct.
She said, I have two choices. They're both horrible. And I have this brief time when I can do something about it.
And I have to.
I
Like
have
that
to.
it is not enough. Like there's not a day after tomorrow. It has to be done.
So that kind of reality check was necessary for her.
It was. And that's the question for each of us. Like, right, as we are doing this hard thing, there could be a variety of things that could happen. There could be a variety of things that should happen. But the biggest question is, are we dialed into the solution? Or are we dialed into that inspiration that's going to come to us and help us get through it? Because she's like, even though she had to figure out how to get through the hard, it had to come to her, right? Because even if we'd all said it a million times and she had case plans and caseworkers and whatever, at some point she had to find a way that worked for her to get through that tremendously hard thing.
And she couldn't be paralyzed by that fear of what was coming. Sometimes people spend a lot of time being afraid and messed up about things that haven't happened yet. And you have to be, you have to get yourself in a good enough place to respond.
Yeah. And I, and being able to look at that mom, like even for her to kind of give me the, like, I told you so, like that was really helpful for her, right? She needed to be able to say, I did it. Like I made it through. Like God didn't let, the thing is she's saying God didn't let this happen. That's not correct. She didn't let this happen. And I'm going to say it's okay to say she partnered with God to get the solution, because she had to embrace the revelation that came to her, the inspiration that came to her in order to say, God will help me solve this problem, but I can't pass on doing the work. I have to do the work.
Yeah. You have to do the work. And I will also say that even when the trial or challenge is long and it's difficult to endure, we do gain strength and knowledge and capacity. We learn things we couldn't have learned any other way. So even though it's a struggle and I guess you would debate whether or not we have to suffer, but
Well, the question is whether we have to. I think we suffer. I think there is pain in life. I think the question is, how do we embrace that as a reality, right? I mean, a toothache hurts. You can't, it's an indication to you, it's a signal,
yeah,
but your life is not a toothache, right? I mean, there are things that hurt, like vinegar is sour.
That's the big
or
stuff.
But the question is, how do you get to choose to embrace the things that are happening, not because they are themselves manifestations of your life, or are they just what they are? Like if you break your ankle, it should hurt. Like if you break your ankle and it does not hurt, that is a bad sign. Like there's probably something else happening.
I don't know if this would be in the fill your lamps or what, and sometimes people are like, what am I doing wrong that this thing happened? And sometimes it's just life. Sometimes you
That's
break your ankle and it's not because you made the wrong choice or because you did something you shouldn't have done. Sometimes you're not being punished by fate or karma or God or whatever.
I'll say you're never punished by God. Some things just happen. And they're usually a result of a variety of collateral consequences.
And how can you help someone else once you become the expert on traumatic brain injury and divorce and whatever chronic pain? How can you help someone?
Yeah.
But not to the point where you're not paying attention to your own needs. So I know you're trying to wrap this up, but if you're aware of the other person's perspective and yours at the same time, right? It's not all about you. It's not all about them. How can both of us have our needs met?
Sure. If possible.
If
It,
possible.
yeah. If you have a counterparty who just wants to be better, they can just be better. If they're not going to embrace reconciliation, if they're not going to embrace, that's what C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, was all about. Oftentimes it was the inability for people to meet the expectations regarding the other person. And that's the question is, why are you being tied to that other person's situation?
So I'm talking about internally considering both perspectives.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's part of your own personal reconciliation.
Right. But I'm just saying, like, what are that person's needs? And in addition, what are my needs in this situation? Not just like, this person needs help, I should help, but also what's going on with me?
Yeah. I think that's fair. I think the first consideration should be, what do I need to do to play a healthy role, or also with awareness of where I'm at.
We've talked about codependency before. Sometimes you get so focused on somebody else's needs and their wants and requirements, requests, whatever, that we neglect, how do I feel about that? Or what is my responsibility? Maybe you're taking responsibility to handle something that is the other person's responsibility.
Absolutely. So you started us, so you're going to take us out?
Sure. This is one of many discussions we have on a variety of topics every month through Steward Growth, our nonprofit, and we would love to have you join us. Next month, we're doing When Life Gives You Lemons again, and we'll have other classes and conversations in the future. We have one tomorrow at noon Mountain Time, and you can find the links on our website, stewardgrowth.com. Thanks, and have a great day.
Thank you.